But it's often, this new phase of maritime trade in the Indian Ocean is often attributed to the formal Roman annexation of Egypt in 30 BC. And traditionally, Western scholars, European scholars, have seen this event as a turning point in Indian Ocean history. I think now we dispute that. And I think now most scholars agree that the Romans walked into an already existing Asian circuit of trade. And that's very clearly represented, in fact, by the presence of related ware, for example, in the Bay of Bengal and India, and as far actually as Malaysia, as you can see from the inset map there. This pottery was manufactured probably somewhere in eastern India, and it circulated from around about the 3rd century BC. So it was quite an early, pre-Roman evidence of a quite well-developed circuit of trade going on already in Asia, long before the arrival of the Europeans. Of course, Europeans like to write Eurocentric history, and they like to see Europe as a centre of everything, but we're very quickly now learning that certainly wasn't the case in so many periods. Another very interesting aspect of this early phase of trade is that it's not only Roman pottery, which we find widely distributed in the Western Indian Ocean, but we actually see Mesopotamian pottery, Parthian period pottery, playing an equally important role. Some work done recently by Roberta Tomba on the Roman amphora from India has indicated that many of those so-called Roman amphora are misidentifications, in fact, of Parthian torpedo jars or Parthian amphora transport jars. And that's a really important point because it challenges again the significance of Rome to the development of Western Indian Ocean trade, maritime trade, an important point. And we can see the same thing at Petani, a very important site that's currently being excavated by Professor Cherry in Kerala, possibly the Muxiris of the Pericles of the Eritrean Sea, where we have the largest assemblage of Roman amphora finds from anywhere in the Western Indian Ocean outside the Red Sea, an extremely important site. And I've been working, kindly at the invitation of Professor Cherry, on some of the pottery from that site. You can see some of the Roman amphora there. But when we look carefully at the pottery, in fact what we find is again, there's a very significant proportion of Mesopotamian Parthian pottery there. So again, it wasn't just Roman influence, it wasn't just Roman contact, it was also Mesopotamian. It was Asian, inter-Asian, internal Asian trade routes, which are just as significant as the external influence of Europe and Rome. Nonetheless, we can see this phase as being a very important time for the beginnings of what we could call limited globalization. We start to see, by sea, interconnection, cultural interconnection, and exchange of religious ideas, technological ideas, and political ideas on a large scale. And this is represented by some of the sites that we can find. This is a Greek Hellenistic temple from Kuwait. And many people don't realize that we have this level of Hellenistic influence as far east as the northern tip of the Gulf here. And you can see very clearly an Ionic, crude Ionic Greek temple. Roman glass is also found widely distributed in the Indian Ocean, and this is another example. There are many that one could give in the United Arab Emirates, not far from Dubai, a site called Ad-Dur, where we have in the graves of this 1st century AD graves, we have a lot of Roman glass being traded, and very clear evidence of this interconnection, this interconnectivity that was developing at the time. And when we look at how those trade routes were developing, we can see that there were probably two major routes into the Indian Ocean, one through the Red Sea, and another down through Mesopotamia, taken by merchants through the rivers, down to the ports around the area which is now occupied by Basra. But this was still, I think up until this point, we're still looking at an Indian Ocean which is divided into two, very large. It's true that some Roman glass has been found in China. It's true that the Silk Road did connect China and the West by land. But broadly speaking, in terms of quantity and volume, the Indian Ocean was still divided into two major spheres, the East and the Western sphere. And very little maritime trade went beyond the southern tip of India into the Eastern Indian Ocean. So we're still looking at a divided world, even though there was localized globalization happening in the different spheres, as I've just shown you. When we come to the Sasanian period, which is in many respects a very key period for the site that we're looking at today, because the 6th century AD, the 4th century AD, the 3rd century AD is when the Sasanian Empire became the Sasanian Empire, is a time where we start to see strong evidence here of trade links. There's a bit of a debate amongst scholars in the West about exactly what the nature of Sasanian maritime trade in the Western Indian Ocean. Some scholars have seen it as a period of economic growth and a boom in trade across the Indian Ocean. I think that we're now beginning to dispute that, and I think we can now see the Sasanian period, in terms of maritime trade, as a period of decline, actually. A late antique decline in certain aspects of Indian Ocean trade. The quantity and the vibrancy of Western Indian Ocean trade, maritime trade during this time, seems to have declined. It's very difficult to find archaeological sites around the shores of the Indian Ocean which were really affected and developed by Sasanian period trade, even though we do have classical sources like Procopius and others that mention trade at this time. When we look at the evidence from Mesopotamia itself, there's particularly the archaeological survey work done by Adams, we can see that this has been identified, the Sasanian period has been identified as a peak in agricultural and rural development. So it's an odds, really. There are two stories. One is that the Sasanian period was one of great prosperity in its own internal agricultural development in the heartland, the population heartland of Mesopotamia, but then in the Indian Ocean, perhaps not so much evidence of trade. But it should be said that some of the evidence that Adams used to illustrate that peak is now being challenged, and it might be that he's a little bit wrong, and that the peak should in fact have happened just in the early Islamic period. And the Sasanian period might not have been quite the boom period that Adams identified. And this map shows some of the evidence we have. We haven't yet got any evidence from the East African coast, for example, of Sasanian contact, and it's very difficult to find evidence of Sasanian contact along the western coast of India. But, and having said that, what we are beginning to find is an alternative pattern, and we are starting to find in Arabia quite a strong presence of Indian pottery being transported the other way. So it's not always a picture of the great civilizations exporting to the east. Here, we've got very good evidence of India exporting something. We don't know what in these pots, possibly ghee, possibly other dairy produce, to Arabia during the Sasanian period. So as we get further into the archaeological evidence, and as we look at it in more detail, we're getting a more nuanced, a more detailed picture of trade patterns. And that's going to help us enormously to understand the way that Indian Ocean trade developed. That's going to help us enormously to understanding a site like Kedah and understanding its role in local circuits of trade and international circuits of trade later on. Really the big change, the fundamental change, the absolutely key change which occurred in Indian Ocean trade is really the rise of Islam. And it's not for religious reasons, it's for political and economic reasons. Because with the rise of Islam, we see the Muslim conquest bringing together the southern part of the Roman Empire and the Sasanian empires under one political organisation. And with the reforms of Abd al-Malik in the late 7th century, we see a new coinage system, a new administrative system, we see the presence of an enormous land empire. In fact, the biggest empire that anybody had seen up until this point, and one of the biggest that's ever been known in history. A very brief piece of research on Google Earth suggests that the Umayyad Empire during the 8th century covered 30 million square kilometres. And you can compare it there with a very similarly inaccurate, possibly inaccurate appraisal of some of the other empires that we know, including the Tang Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, and Han China. And you can see the difference in scale. So in bringing together the population and the economic potential of that vast area, we see something completely new. We see a massively wealthy and important and powerful geographical empire with strong links to the Indian Ocean. And we see those links being developed almost immediately, and that, in my opinion, is a key and fundamental change to the way that maritime trade operated in the Indian Ocean. We know then that shortly after the Islamic conquest, in about 750, in the middle of the 8th century, the Abbasid revolution occurred, and the centre of the Islamic power moved from Damascus initially to Kufa, and then later to Baghdad after the founding of Baghdad in 762 AD. And we see Mesopotamia becoming the central heartland of that enormous and powerful empire. Baghdad, as I mentioned, was founded in 762 AD, and it very rapidly, within 10 years, became probably the biggest city in the world. We don't know very much archaeologically about Baghdad because it's buried underneath the modern capital of Iraq. So all we can do is reconstruct it from historical descriptions, and you can see it was probably a circular city, according to the descriptions of Yahoo, on the basis of a model that was used in this region at this time. To imagine that within 10 years the city had become one of the biggest in the world illustrates the power, the economic drive and dynamism of the Abbasid Empire. At the beginning of the 9th century, for various political reasons, the Abbasid caliphs founded a new capital at Samarra, about 200 kilometers to the north of Baghdad. And it is, in fact, it was only occupied for about 60 years, but it is even today the largest archaeological site in the world. Well, that might be contested, but it's 40 kilometers long. In fact, to try and illustrate that scale, I've put a 2-scale map of the site, of Sungai Batu, the site that we visited, some of us visited yesterday. You can see the map of the site on the right, Professor Mukhtar's map of the site on the right, and the little square in the red circle on the left shows the same site at the same scale as Samarra. Now, I'm not doing this to make this site look small. I'm doing this to illustrate to you the scale of development that was occurring in the Abbasid Empire. It's phenomenal. And you can see that the size of the site there, from Mutawakkaliyah in the north all the way down to Qadisiyah in the south, is absolutely astounding. Population, the land investment, the building effort, everything illustrates a scale of economic development that is just unparalleled anywhere in the world at this time. It's a superpower. It's the global superpower of the era. Sometimes that fact is forgotten. That fact is not acknowledged historically to the degree that it really needs to be if we want to understand how the Indian Ocean developed. And it's not unrelated to the Straits of Malacca. It's not unrelated to Kedah, because the demand, the market demand of the population, the massive population and the huge economic potential and wealth of Mesopotamia was a massively important development, element of development in the Indian Ocean. It was a huge market, and we can see very early in the Abbasid period, we can see trade with China, direct maritime trade with China, we can see Chinese pottery being imported, we can see a very strong effect, which I'll now illustrate to you, of that economic pull which Mesopotamia represented. The graph here shows, as I mentioned, that Adams' survey work in southern Mesopotamia suggested that the Abbasid period was a period of agricultural decline. I think we can now dispute that to some degree, and I think that it was at least a period of equal development to the Sasanian period. I don't think we're actually looking at a period of decline. There's some inaccuracy in that evidence there. But what we can see very clearly through historical and archaeological evidence is the effect of this massively important, very wealthy trading centre, Baghdad, on the Indian Ocean. We can see in Scandinavia, we can see tens of thousands of Abbasid dirhams, coins, which have been found. We can see gold coins in India. You can see that beautiful Rashtrakuta coin there, which has got Sanskrit writing on it. And if you look carefully, it looks like an Indian coin, but when you look carefully, you can see the Arabic script around the edge, just demonstrating that even in Rashtrakuta Hindu India, the significance, the cultural significance of the Abbasid world was being acknowledged. And that's also illustrated by the clipped Abbasid dirham, which was also found on the coast of India. And that photograph of the blue glazed jar on the top right-hand corner of the slide is a jar that's presently in Beijing Museum, which I photographed myself. And that is a jar manufactured close to Basra. And many hundreds of those jars, thousands of those jars, were exported around the Indian Ocean as far as China. Again, illustrating the power and the importance of the Abbasid Mesopotamian Empire at this time. If we look at the historical evidence and the Cairo-Geniza documents, and His Excellency the Chief Minister was asking yesterday about where we might find references to the site, the Kedah site, so this is one area where we might find evidence. These are a series of papyri and texts written in Arabic and Hebrew that were found in a mosque in Cairo, and which give us a very detailed illustration of the way that Indian Ocean trade was functioning during the 10th century, the 9th and 10th centuries. And we see a whole list, in fact, of commodities, many of which would have come through or from Malaysia at this time, on their way to the Mediterranean and on their way to serving and the consumption of the Islamic Empire. Chinese pottery, which I already mentioned, is a very important commodity. China was exporting many things. Silk was probably the most important one, but Chinese pottery is important because it survives in the archaeological record and it allows us to understand the degree and the importance to which China was, the role that China was playing in this trade. And the graph there on the slide shows us a quantification of Chinese pottery from archaeological sites in the Gulf through the 8th through to the 15th centuries. And you can see, starting off quite slowly and slowly developing, quite rapidly developing into a major commodity. This illustrates what I think is happening at this time, which is the beginnings of globalization. With the unification of the Indian Ocean, with the first direct sailing by Muslim sailors to China on a regular basis, we really start to see the unification of the Indian Ocean and the globalization, the true beginnings of the globalization of the world economy. A very good illustration of this is an archaeological phenomenon. I'm sure that you will know the Leiden shipwreck, which is excavated not very far away from here, and a massively important site for understanding this period, the best preserved site of this period from anywhere. And you can see it was full of Changsha pottery manufactured in Hunan province in China. You can see some illustrations of the ship here being excavated. It was reconstructed actually by the Sultan of Oman, and a present of the finished boat was given to the Singapore government, probably you know this a few years ago. I know it's been quite a controversial excavation for many reasons, and I agree with some of that controversy, but when we look at the boat, and when we look at what it tells us, it's still, despite the problems, a very important archaeological site. You can see this reconstruction of the probable route that the boat was taking, possibly intending eventually to head through the Straits of Malacca on its way to the Arabian Gulf. Probably a boat, almost certainly, manufactured either in the Gulf or by Gulf technology. And this map here shows us the distribution of some of the artifacts and some of the historical references that are probably linked to the course of that boat. So you can see that there's a lot of Chinese material, there's stuff from as far to the west as Egypt. So the boat was a multicultural, very mixed, very globalized little economic enterprise on its own. And it was it was one of many thousands that must have sailed in the Indian Ocean at this time. One of the very few that we've been able to excavate. And it tells us an enormous amount about how integrated the Indian Ocean was becoming at this time. You can see there's no division really between East and West anymore. The Indian Ocean is unified. Why is that an important fact? Because we're on the Straits of Malacca. And this is the key link between those two halves of the Indian Ocean. So this is emphasizing really the importance of the unification of the Islamic world under that great empire, and the importance that that unification has to the economic development of trade in the Indian Ocean. Absolutely fundamental. And of course we, as many of you I'm sure know, we see the development, historical evidence for possibly diplomatic missions to China by the Muslims, sailings from China as well to the Indian Ocean. We know that there were mercantile communities of Muslims settling in China. We know that they had occasional problems. We know that they existed. We know that they built mosques. But we know that they were there. And we can see their presence by the pottery, as I just mentioned, going in both directions. When we look at this trade, we can see that when it started off, it was probably individual sailings from southern Mesopotamia, from Basra, all the way directly to China. That's a massively long journey. It would have taken a year. And then with a turnaround time of possibly as much as a year, then another year back, merchants such as Sinbad, the famous Sinbad, would probably have been away from home for as many as 3 years, going off to make his fortune by trading with China. And I'm sure that his wife wouldn't have been that happy with him when he got home. So what we see happening after a very short time is that the circuits start to break down. And we see merchants operating on a shorter set of circuits with the development of nodal emporia, trading emporia, at different points around the Indian Ocean. And this is, again, it's key. Why? Because the Straits of Malacca were exactly one of those important nodal points. Those points themselves became key areas of economic development and key points in the globalization of the world economy. And that map gives us an illustration. That's A.N. Chowdhury's work in his Quet Events 1995 book. Just to have a very quick look, and I know that my time's nearly up, I'm just finishing, but have a very quick look at one or two sites which were affected by this trade. Sanjan in India, on the western coast of India, where we've got a lot of Abbasid pottery, showing the importance of this Islamic trade to the development of a single rural site on the coast of India. There must have been many hundreds of very similar sites. In Sri Lanka, at Kisamaharam, again, a very important site in Sri Lankan history. And when we look at the pottery that's been found, there's an enormous amount of Abbasid traded pottery, as well as Chinese pottery. So again, another nodal point on Indian Ocean trade being stimulated, being developed by this economic heat. And I think the last example is a very interesting site in East Africa, in Kenya, Shanga. And I'm using it only because it's such a good example. And what we see is the arrival of Muslim traders, probably in the 7th or late 7th, early 8th century, onto the shores of where we're probably just finding small villages of fishermen who were really uninterested in trade. But when they began to get into contact with the Muslim traders arriving from Mesopotamia, from Iraq, they started to procure ivory, procure slaves, procure gold and wood, the things that the traders were after. And the settlement itself developed from a small fishing village into quite a substantial town over a very short period of time. And this slide here shows the 8 different phases of excavation, from the latest phase at the bottom right to the earliest phase, or from the earliest phase on the top left to the latest phase on the bottom right. If you look at the top, if you look at the top left, and I've circled here the mosque, if the top left corner, the area which is circled in red was a small shrine. It looks like it was a shrine, an animist shrine, certainly not an Islamic shrine. Very soon after this town began to develop, we see the construction of a mosque over the top of that. So we can imagine that the local community had converted to Islam. And then step by step, we see that mosque being enlarged and beautified, along with the wealth and the size of the Muslim community there, until by the end of the sequence of the site, we see quite a substantial mosque on the site. So we see here, and the reason I'm choosing this is it's probably only one example of many thousands of sites around the Indian Ocean that were engaged in this trade in the early Islamic period, and whose lives were transformed completely, economically, intellectually, and religiously and culturally. They were completely transformed by this engagement with this new economic heat of Indian Ocean trade that was going on during the early medieval period, because of the presence of this enormous global empire. And in fact, Janet Adenlogot, in her World Systems Theory work a few years ago, made a similar argument and illustrated, in fact, by showing the development of cities around the world, from China to Egypt and France. And she tried to show that some of the big cities of the world all developed in a very similar way, at a similar pace, throughout this early medieval period. And she argued on that basis that the world was becoming, at this time, had already become interconnected. It had the beginnings of the globalization of the world economy had already started at this time. And then, as far as Mesopotamia is concerned, by about the 10th or 11th century, things start to turn away. And we can forget, to some degree, about Mesopotamia, probably because of mismanagement, possibly because of overspending on the government, possibly because of not enough investment in infrastructure, and I'm sure the Chief Minister's listening to my words right now. We see Abbasid Iraq began to decline, and we see disinvestment in the countryside, we see problems, and initially we see the Buid invasion and conquest, and then eventually we see the shifting away, and Cairo, the capital of Egypt, became the economic center of the Islamic world. Baghdad ceased to be so, and trade through the Gulf and trade into Mesopotamia ceased to be important. But that doesn't mean that Islamic trade and trade by Muslim traders ceased to be important. As we know, that went on, and as we know, Islam became one of the key religions in the Indian Ocean. Arabic became the lingua franca of the Indian Ocean for many hundreds of years. And that symbolizes, really, the importance of Islam and the importance of the development of the Islamic Empire to Indian Ocean trade. So we can conclude just a few points. Mesopotamia engaged in maritime trade from very early, from the Neolithic. And it seems, though, to have gone then through a series of different periods of engagement. Some periods when it was heavily engaged in maritime trade, and other periods when it seems not to have been interested. And there's very good evidence for engagement during the Parthian period, but less, for example, in the Sasanian period, both of which are important to the site that we're discussing today. There is evidence, as I've illustrated to you today, that the Abbasid period was a very important period for the whole of the Indian Ocean, as far as China. With its large population, very important population centre, Iraq's economic power would have affected production and distribution across the whole of the Indian Ocean. And I'm arguing really that during the 8th century, that the economy of the entire Indian Ocean began to knit together for the first time in history. Globalized, literally, for the first time. And this is a very important event, particularly, as I said, for Malaysia, for the Straits of Malacca, and the site that we're discussing today. So I hope, in saying these things, I provide a little bit of a broad historical background, context, to the development of the site that we're studying, and I hope that will help us to understand a little bit the role this site and the Straits of Malacca played in world history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kennet.